Welcome, Ian, to the Immortal Art. I ask everybody the first question the same. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, first, Eldon, thank you for inviting me on the program. Much appreciated. My name's Ian Gilligan. I'm an honorary associate in the discipline of archaeology at the University of Sydney in Australia. My research focus is on the origins of human clothing and what we can find out about when humans started wearing clothes and why in the prehistorical period. That is, I'm not interested in clothing in the historical era. That's since writing began around 5,000 years ago. So that entire period, which is very well researched in terms of clothing and fashion, that's not my area at all. I'm looking the archaeology of early clothing and also in a broader anthropological sense, what we can infer about the reasons why humans adopted clothing from cross-cultural studies, including hunter-gatherer studies. So I'm bringing in those fields of research, anthropological, and also past climate change and how that may have affected the use of clothing by humans.
What inspired your transition from studying or working in medicine to pursuing archaeology?
Yes, Eldon, a lot of people ask me that because it's an unusual combination, but I also graduated in psychology. That was before I went into medicine. So my expertise is in the disciplines of psychology, biology in terms of human physiology, and also anthropology, particularly archaeology, but also hunter-gatherer studies. The reasons why I went into those because I became really fascinated by the question of why humans wear clothes. At a personal level, I have no interest in clothing at all. It's purely an academic interest that I have. And it became clear to me that to make sense of why we wear clothing and to explore that, it really is a multidisciplinary endeavour. We need to look at hunter-gatherer studies, we need to look at from archaeology, from past climate change, and also psychology in terms of why do humans wear clothing, the development of modesty, and a shame about being naked as one of the motives for wearing clothes. So I needed to get a background in all of those disciplines to be able to get a truly interdisciplinary uh, uh, look at the question of why we wear clothes.
Could you outline the central themes of your work on climate, clothing, and agriculture in history?
Yes, Eldon. The book was published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press. It's essentially in two halves. The first half looks at what we can infer about the evidence for the origin of clothing and also past climate change, and also bringing in hunter-gatherer studies. So the first half of the book is looking at this question of what we can say about the origins of clothing. The second half of the book is looking at a more controversial question, which is whether clothing, particularly textile clothing, may have played a role in the origins of agriculture, because agriculture only began 12,000 years ago, whereas modern humans, Homo sapiens, we've been around for 300,000 years. So agriculture is quite a new development, and not all societies made the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. But the development of agriculture has had massive repercussions in terms of supporting much larger human populations and allowing societies to become more complex, ultimately resulting in what used to be called civilization. We no longer use that word. We talk about complex societies and state organized societies, but that's all been very recent, Eldon. And the classic argument about agriculture is it was a better way of feeding people. But the problem with that, if it was such a good idea in terms of feeding people, then it should have happened much earlier in human prehistory, and it should have occurred across all human societies. But we don't see that. That's a very recent and quite localized development in a few parts of the world. It occurred to me that when we look at the evidence for early agriculture, it's not just about feeding people, it's also domesticating animals, and those animals provided other resources besides food, particularly textile fibres such as wool, and even agriculture, that is plant agriculture, didn't just involve the production of food for human consumption. A lot of the cereal crops were used to feed animals, particularly sheep. Also, crops were used for their fibres. Flax was used to make linen, and cotton, of course, very big. From my point of view, that's an obvious reason for people to start engaging in agriculture. It's not just about feeding humans, it's about feeding animals, and animals not just for meat, but for production of textile fibres, which is the renewable resource. And that explains why humans went to the bother of taming and domesticating animals, because as long as the animals were kept alive, then they continued to produce textile fibres on an annual basis. Whereas if you want to eat meat, then you have to kill the animal, and that's what hunters do. So, from my point of view, there's a lot of reasons why we need to question the origins of agriculture and whether the advent of textile fibres for clothing may resolve some of the enigmas about early agriculture. The other question is, why textile clothing? Why did that happen? And the answer to that, Eldon, I think, is because of climate change. At the end of the last ice age, around 12,000 years ago, up till that point, as far as we know, the materials for clothing were essentially animal hides and furs. Problem with those materials is that they're very impractical in a hot climate. And what happened around 12,000 years ago is that the global climate transitioned very rapidly from cold ice age conditions, which are also quite dry because so much of the moisture in circulation is tied up in the expanded polar ice cap. So ice ages are not only colder, but they're also drier. What happened at the beginning of the Holocene epoch, which is the current epoch that we're living in, is that the climate became not only warmer, but also more humid. And from a clothing perspective, that's where textiles come into their own, because textiles allow perspiration to evaporate, are much more comfortable to wear in a hot environment. That's why there's this transition in clothing technology to textiles. And I think that is one of the reasons why agriculture only began at the beginning of the Holocene epoch.
In what ways might the need for clothing influence the agriculture, or was it other way around as well?
It's certainly a two-way process, but we come back to this question of what prompted agriculture in the first place, because from a hunter-gatherer point of view, it doesn't make much sense. Hunting and gathering is a very secure and flexible way of getting food, even in quite harsh environments like deserts in Central Australia. Indigenous Australians had no problem finding food and water. To make the transition to agriculture, it has a lot of drawbacks in the early days. It's like putting all your eggs in one basket. You're focusing on one or two species. It's very vulnerable, and the evidence is that in the early agricultural societies, there were frequent famines, and human nutrition, in fact, deteriorated in the early days of agriculture. We have to come back to this question of why agriculture started. Does it make sense from a food point of view? I don't think so. We need another factor, I think, and that is textile clothing. I think that resolves the issue. I think that tipped the balance, but only in those areas, Eldon, where people were wearing clothes on a very regular basis, and where clothing had become a social necessity as well as even more than thermal insulation. So that's why only in some societies where people were wearing clothes for cultural and personal reasons, that's why agriculture only started in those contexts. In other parts of the world where people were not wearing clothes on a regular basis, they did not make the transition to agriculture because there was no need to.
If humans have, yeah, we have clothes, and that depends on societies, but when did we lost fur?
That's a very good question, Eldon. That's very important too, because regardless of whether humans wear clothes or not, we are biologically naked in the sense that we have lost substantial fur cover over our bodies. We retain hair on top of our head actually because it acts as portable shade. But that's obviously very important because that's why we invented clothes during the last ice ages. When humans were in cold environments, they needed to wear clothes, whereas other animals don't. They have adequate fur cover. Why that happened and when that happened is not really known. We suspect from a number of lines of evidence that our ancestors became biologically naked probably from around 2 million years ago. There's a number of lines of evidence that point to that. And that means that when the Ice Ages started, which was around 2.5 million years ago, humans were in a very difficult situation outside of the tropics. And that's why they began wearing clothes. Why we became biologically naked, it's one of the defining attributes of Homo sapiens. There are other naked animals, species, obviously, but they're not in the situation where they're trying to survive in very cold environments.
Speaking about losing the fur, I read this paper that says that we lost the fur because we start running.
The hypothesis that Homo sapiens, the ancestors of Homo sapiens, lost their fur cover as an adaptation to heat stress. That has problems, a bit like agriculture being about food production. Most animal species in the tropics retain their fur cover. And one of the reasons for that is that fur can function as portable shade. So even in hot climates, it can be advantageous to have a fur cover. One of the intriguing theories, which was promoted by Peter Wheeler in the 1980s, was that there's a connection between humans becoming upright, bipedal, and loss of fur cover. And the reason is that for an animal on four legs, exposure to the overhead sun is a problem, and that's why fur cover is useful even in those hot environments. However, if an animal is standing on two legs, is bipedal, then it is advantageous to lose fur cover over the body. And that then allows for greater cooling, and especially if, as is the case with hominins, that if it's accompanied by an increase in perspiration, in sweating, then without the fur cover, then sweating can aid cooling. So there may well be a connection between upright posture and loss of fur cover. And as I mentioned before, for a bipedal animal, it's still useful to keep hair cover over the head.
I read also a paper that agriculture in Middle East started because these humans started making beer and the bread was a extra thing that they did after making beer.
Yes, there's some evidence for that, and Brian Hayden in Canada developed that theory. He pointed out that there is evidence for brewing in the early days of agriculture, and that's one of the purposes that the cereal crop served. So it's not unusual once innovation occurs, then it can be promoted for different reasons, and other factors can come into play. Often the main reasons why a technology is used down the track are quite different to the reasons why it began in the first place. So it's not unusual that agriculture would serve multiple purposes from very early on. And yes, that's true. That's a very interesting theory. I don't think anyone suggests it's the main reason or the original reason, but yes, it's an amusing hypothesis.
Why we as a species started our agriculture. We don't know why.
That's right, Eldon. And when you think about it, archaeologists have been looking into that question for a century. And the fact that we haven't got an answer, I think that should alert us to the fact that maybe the basic assumptions we're making about agriculture need to be questioned. And that assumption is that if it's about producing food for human.
What can the invention and use of eye needle tell us about early human cognition and social organization as well?
When we look at the archaeological evidence for clothing, we don't have any actual clothing remains from the Ice Age. The earliest fabrics that we have are around 10,000 years old, and the oldest garment in the world is around 5,000 years old. But we do have indirect evidence in the form of technologies that were used to manufacture clothing. It's not just the eyed needle. One of the most basic technologies is the hide scraper tool for making them into clothes. So it's not just the eyed needle. In fact, you don't need eyed needles to make even quite complex tailored fitted garments. The eyed needles that we find in Siberia and northern China from around 40,000 years ago are interesting because they weren't necessary for making tailored garments. Other technologies sufficed. Last year, we published a paper with Francesco De Rico and some other colleagues looking at this question of why humans in some parts of the world developed eyed needles. And the answer may well be because of this transition in clothing, that once clothing was being worn on a very regular daily basis for tens of thousands of years, probably going back at least 40 to 50,000 years ago in northern uh, mid latitudes, that clothing then acquired the functions of dress. When clothing's not worn regularly, people adorn themselves by painting their bodies, by deliberately scarifying their skin. Those functions of body adornment were not really viable when people are covering their bodies pretty much a permanent basis from around 40 to 50,000 years ago. So that means that this important social function of body adornment had to be transferred onto the surface of clothing. And we find some archaeological evidence beads and pierced shells that were probably sewn onto the surface of clothing. And that's perhaps one reason why eyed needles were invented, is they allowed much more efficient and more delicate sewing, not just for tailoring garments, but also for adorning the surface of clothing for social display. And I think that makes a lot of sense.
What are most common myths and misunderstandings people have about clothing in prehistoric time?
One of the assumptions is that people were always wearing clothing, that it's part of being a modern human. And the evidence that we have is that that's clearly not the case. That clothing was a quite recent innovation and only occurred in some parts of the world, particularly in colder environments. Whilst in our societies, of course, wearing clothes is perfectly normal and necessary for social purposes, that clearly is not the case. There are many hunter-gatherer societies, particularly here in Australia, for example, but in other parts of the world as well. Decorating clothes is actually much more difficult. We take it for granted, of course. We can walk into a shop and we've got plenty of options for decorated clothes, but in a hunter-gatherer context, that's not the case. It's social display. It's much more efficient and effective to alter the appearance of the unclad body.
So, what makes Australia's Paleolithic story distinct from that of other continents?
In some ways, the Australian archaeological record is quite unique. One of the obvious differences is that there's no evidence for agriculture in Indigenous Australia. There have been some arguments about that recently, but essentially that's all been refuted. Australian Aborigines were very successful hunter-gatherers. So the absence of agriculture is interesting, not necessarily an obvious thing for hunter-gatherers to do. The other interesting thing about Australia is that clothing was not used by Indigenous Australians. They did have some clothes in the colder parts of Australia, and they used hide scrapers and the kangaroo capes and cloaks, but not on a regular basis, and certainly not, there was no sense of shame, even when they were wearing clothes for thermal purposes. There was no problems with needing to hide the genitalia. Perfectly fine, not only in Indigenous Australia, but in other parts of the world, in Africa and parts of South America. The other interesting thing about Australia, the archaeological record, is not just in the absence of agriculture, but moving into the historical period in the last 200 odd years, when white people, after they invaded this continent around 200 years ago, agriculture in the colonial situation was not about feeding humans primarily. Most of the agriculture in Australia was devoted to breeding sheep for wool production and feeding sheep with cereal crops, particularly wheat.
I have this note here asked about evidence and dating of the first arrivals in Sahol. Am I saying it right?
Yes, Elvin. During the last ice age, because the sea levels dropped as water was held up into the polar ice caps, land bridges were opened up and Australia was joined to the island of New Guinea in the north, and Tasmania was joined to the mainland across Bass Strait. So that greater continent comprising what is now the island of New Guinea, the Australian continent, and Tasmania, that combined supercontinent is called Sahul. The earliest evidence we have for humans entering Sahul is around 50,000 years ago. And in case of Tasmania, humans arrived there around 35,000 years ago. They simply walked across the exposed land bridge. So, yeah, that's the supercontinent of Sahul.
Despite the lack of preserved textiles, what hypotheses exist about clothing or use of clothing by early Australians, and how did they get the raw materials?
Yes, Alvin, it's interesting that although Indigenous Australians had textile technologies and basketry, there's no evidence that they ever used textile clothing. They used animal skins and furs. What is intriguing, particularly in the case of Tasmania, where I've done a lot of my research, is that whereas when white visitors first encountered the Tasmanian Aborigines, Tasmanians were naked. They occasionally would throw a small wallaby skin over their shoulders, but even then the early visitors described the use of these skins mainly as bags, and women would carry them around, even carry their babies. So there's really very little in the way of clothing, even in a relatively cold climate like Tasmania. When we look at the archaeological evidence, what we see is once humans arrived in the Tasmania from around 35,000 years ago, we find the archaeological record contains lots of hide scraper tools. We also find bone awls, not hide needles, but bone awls that were used to sew the wallaby skins together. So I think that's really interesting because whereas the technologies of Tasmanian Aborigines were fairly simple at the time of whites visitors arrived, they actually had the most sophisticated technologies in the world. And that's where we see these new technologies appearing in Tasmania. But the intriguing thing is, one of the intriguing things with Tasmania is that those technologies disappeared largely from around 10,000 years ago. So what's likely to have happened is that because even when they sewed the wallaby skins together to make large cloaks, they never developed or didn't need to develop more sophisticated tailored clothing. Conditions in the southern hemisphere were always milder compared to the northern hemisphere, even during ice ages, and that's because of the larger oceanic masses in the southern hemisphere that keep the climate a little bit warmer.
Can you explain for my audience what was the cultural shift in changing the names from primitive to aboriginal or indigenous and so forth?
Yes, Eldon, there's been many problems with the terminologies that we use and the way we depict other cultures. And I mentioned even the case of hunting and gathering. I have a problem with that concept because it essentially defines indigenous cultures on the basis of primarily on their food economy, whereas I think other things such as clothing are more important. During the colonial era, one of the key features of these hunter-gatherer societies was the absence of clothing. More than anything else, it was their nakedness that bothered the Europeans and led to all kinds of uh, misunderstandings. Here in Australia, it was very much the case. One of the early visitors, of course, was Captain Cook, and made that very point: is that how can these people be descendants of Adam and Eve? Because in the biblical scenario, humans adopt clothing and kept clothing ever since then. But if people are not wearing clothes, they can't be descendants of Adam and Eve. So those kind of comments and observations and interpretations are very much part of the problem with the early accounts. And it continues right through discipline of anthropology into the 20th century, where it's very easy for white people to impose their own perceptions onto Indigenous cultures. And it's one of the reasons why there have been so many problems for archaeologists as well in dealing with Indigenous peoples, because you can't blame them for having a negative view of white colonial cultures.
How important is to include indigenous people perspectives when interpreting archaeological findings related to clothing, symbolism, art, and so forth?
Yes, it's absolutely essential because the white people make assumptions and interpretations that may be totally irrelevant to the situation with Indigenous cultures. It's very difficult to reconstruct Indigenous perspectives on many things because of the tremendous damage that's been done to Indigenous cultures, not just in Australia, of course. And it's very difficult even for Indigenous people to be able to regain the understandings and perspectives of their ancestors. There's been so much lost, so much damage done. So we need to be very sensitive to the interpretations of Indigenous peoples, not just here in Australia. Some of these other perspectives may be very useful in terms of understanding how clothing has altered the way we look at ourselves and the world around us.
Why do we have shame and some cultures don't?
That's a very good question, Eldon, because what we can see from looking at Indigenous cultures where clothing was not worn routinely, that there was no sense of shame about appearing naked in society. Most societies function perfectly well without without clothing. I think what has happened is just as we saw with the transition in clothing function from physical necessity to symbolic and social necessity, that humans are and their societies are using clothing on a very regular basis for tens of thousands of years. Because clothing acquires those important social functions, it becomes necessary for people to be clothed, regardless of the climate even. To appear naked causes a sense of embarrassment, a sense of being inadequate for social purposes. I think that's where modesty and shame comes into the picture. Only occurs in situations where clothing is very sophisticated and used very regularly. Where that's not the case, even where some clothing may be used, for example, in Indigenous Australia, it never got to the point where people felt somehow inadequate or ashamed if they weren't wearing clothes. So I think that's what happens. Just as clothing becomes important for dress and for social display, lack of clothing then becomes a source of embarrassment socially.
What is connection between purely functional and symbolic meaning of the clothing in the early societies?
Yes, Elvin, my uh, theory is that clothing in the first instance was for thermal insulation. And as far as possible, people continued to use body painting and other forms of adorning the naked skin surface. What has happened is that, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere during the last ice age, from around 40,000 years ago, when humans are needing to wear clothing all the time, and that's when clothing becomes quite symbolic functions, functions that were previously served by body painting and scarification. So that's where this transition occurs. And we're talking here of tens of thousands of years, from around 40,000 years ago in the case of Russia and northern China, up until the end of the last ice age around 12,000 years ago. So over those tens of thousands of years, clothing became a social necessity and it acquired symbolic functions that had previously been served by adorning the naked skin surface. Once that happened, we have this change in function of clothing, that in the world today, clothing is primarily a social and symbolic artifact. It's still used for keeping warm in some environments, but even Sweden now in a heat wave, people are still wearing clothes, and they're wearing clothes for social and symbolic purposes.
What about the psychological or cultural significance of clothing as a second skin?
So one of the points that I make is that whereas we focus on clothing as dress in terms of its outer appearance, I wonder whether clothing actually also simultaneously acts as a barrier that separates us from the natural environment. So as a second skin, we become attached to clothing. In doing so, we become more detached from our natural surroundings. And I think that's one of the psychological effects of clothing. And I think it has massive social implications as well, that we as modern day humans, we live in a largely artificial environment where you mentioned clothing as a second skin, but there's a third skin as well, and that is the the artificial environment that we build around us, the walls and the houses that we create. And I see that as another repercussion of clothing, that in a sense we become detached from the natural environment through clothing, and we then create an artificial environment that in many ways also serves to separate us more from the natural environment. So there's other repercussions, I think, come into play. And we see that happening again only quite recently in human prehistory, from around 12,000 years ago.
You mentioned symbolism in clothing. I would really like to speak with you about cultural identity or personal identity sometimes within the cultures that are invented clothing.
I think what you're asking is how clothing serve fundamental purposes for social display and social identity. In the case of Western cultures, clothing is absolutely fundamental. It is, I think, the one artifact that defines our cultures. And that's one of the reasons why the routine nakedness of Indigenous peoples uh, created such a big problem, because they obviously have different ways of displaying themselves, and their social identity does not involve needing to cover themselves. Those other ways of decorating themselves become really very important. Unfortunately, a lot of that is invisible archaeologically. What we do have, though, is some evidence for the use of colouring agents such as ochre And that was present here in Australia from day one, around 50,000 years ago. We find ochre at archaeological sites.
People in ice ages in northern Europe, and they had clothes of furs of animals they hunted, cave lions or bears. And if it's purely functional, we don't have to have these predator animals as the head garment, but people did it. Did they absorb these spirits, the power, the essence of animal? What was the goal of it?
We can only speculate as to the purposes, Eldon, of why people used animal skins and furs for decorative and symbolic purposes. Archaeologically, we can infer that the skins were used, even in the case of lions, because of the cut marks on the skeletal material, where you can see that the skins were very carefully removed. So, yes, presumably people were using these warm skins and furs not just for thermal insulation, but for symbolic functions. But we need to be careful about speculating too much about that. We just don't know for sure. We have intriguing clues, and of course, cave paintings showing humans wearing headdresses and clearly using the clothing for symbolic functions. Yes, so that probably goes back from very early on, when particularly when clothing became more sophisticated with tailored clothing, because of this need to use clothing for decorative purposes rather than body adornment.
No, I was just wondering because in my head, a person who has a lion skin or a bear skin, I always imagine that they show off. I killed this lion. I'm the bravest. I can protect you and so forth. And because that's also very important in European Upper Paleolithic.
Well, one of the most spectacular Upper Paleolithic Ice Age sites is in Russia near Moscow. The site is called Sungir, and there are a number of human burials there. But what's really fascinating is that there are thousands of mammoth ivory beads, and the way those beads are arranged on the skeletons, they were clearly sewn onto sophisticated tailored clothing when conditions were incredibly cold. It's cold enough these days in the Moscow region. You can imagine if average temperatures are 5 to 10 degrees lower, how necessary clothing was. But we also find not only that these garments were highly decorated, but there are pendants, there are Arctic fox canine teeth that were obviously carefully sewn onto these garments at 34,000 years ago. So again, we do have evidence for this shift in clothing from pure functional necessity to important symbolic functions.
What are the main challenges of interpreting evidence of clothing that archaeology has discovered?
I think one of the challenges is what we've been talking about is the symbolic functions of clothing and when that really took off. We do know that it had developed by around 40,000 years ago, and iron needles were probably very important for decorating clothing and attaching beads. We're largely in the dark. We can only speculate based on what we know from hunter-gatherer studies, the purposes that body adornment served. What specific functions were served, we're largely in the dark, and I don't see how we can get around that. But it's important that we do have the evidence for the symbolic functions of clothing.
Do you know about Venus of Brasempeux?
Oh yes, yes.
Do you think that she wears a head garment to cover her hair, or is it braids?
People listening to the podcast aren't going to see what I'm holding up here. Here's one of these Venus figurines, and you can see there what appears to be a cap, probably a woven cap on her head. We also have this beautiful example. No, maybe this is the one you're talking about,
Yes,
Eldon.
yes.
It's not entirely clear whether she, or everyone assumes it's a she, could be a he. Someone else has pointed that out. But it does look as though she has sort of braided her hair in a uh, very delicate manner. And the other famous figurine, of course, is this one here, where there appears to be a kind of a skirt covering her posterior. Don't know if you can see that
Yes.
there we are, yeah. So these figurines are enigmatic. They're called Venus figurines, but even that's problematic. So there may well be examples of woven headdress in some of these figurines as well. But it's interesting, of course, that they're essentially naked, but in this case, just wearing a cap. And what symbolic or other functions these figurines served, we really don't know.
No, I made an episode exactly about that. So we will never know about those stuff.
But that's one of the things that makes archaeology so fascinating is that we will always have unanswered questions, and then new evidence can come up, which can sometimes be surprising and it can alter the way we interpret things. So, but sometimes it's good to not necessarily have all of the answers, Eldon.
Was it needle invented on multiple places or just in one place?
It looks as though the eye needle was invented independently in a number of places. The world authority on that subject is Francisco de Rico, and he's certainly of the view that the needles in Siberia and northern China were probably invented independently. And there's interesting differences in the shapes of the needles, the size of the needles, and other physical attributes. Didn't appear in Western Europe until quite late. Around 20 odd thousand years ago. So that may well have spread from Eastern Asia into Western Europe.
If you could have a dinner with anybody in the world, historical figure, character from a book, whoever, who would it be and why?
That's a very difficult question. I mean, there's so many heroes in the history of science. I'm not an artist, I'm more of a scientist, but so many very influential figures over the last few centuries in particular that have influenced me enormously. Charles Darwin, obviously, Sigmund Freud, even, and some of the great physicists, particularly those who started uh, quantum mechanics. Absolutely amazing history of science there. Another hero of mine, um, Copernicus, of course. We take these figures for granted and their contributions and how they change the way we look at things. So there's a long list, actually. I'd probably want to have a dinner party with half a dozen people, I think.
What is the name of your book?
The name of the book is Climate, Clothing and Agriculture in Prehistory, and it was published in 2019 by Cambridge University Press. It's quite a readable book, and I've had many people say that to me. I've really avoided too much fancy terminology and tried to keep things very simple so that someone can read the book and enjoy it, I think, who doesn't necessarily have a good grounding in archaeology or prehistory.
It was a pleasure talking to you, and I'm very happy that we did it. You expanded my knowledge and understanding of clothing. I would encourage people to buy your book, to read it, and hopefully you will get your retirement from the book proceedings.
I'm not holding my breath, Eldon, but as I said, there are free chapters available online, so people don't necessarily even have to part with any money, and it is available online. Physical copies of the book, and no one, as I say, buys books these days.
Thank you for doing this, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your evening.
Thank you, Eldon. It's been a real pleasure, and I much appreciate the invitation. It's been a lot of
Yes.
fun, actually.